Do you want to introduce it, or?
Sure. Hello and welcome to a special edition of the Supernatural Side Salad Show. Me and Quantum today are joined by a guest who has joined us to discuss, or perhaps even debate, the rather large issue of feminism and gender politics. This, to my understanding, began during an exchange via Twitter and is carried over into a live discussion here, which we are going to continue at the moment. The discussion will be a non-Socratic debate, loosely informal, and I think we can begin by sort of if you could, for us both, elaborate on where you guys disagreed and how this discussion began via Twitter.
Do you want to start, or is your show?
I don't. You can start if you want. I think.
Well, the initial argument came from I had read that Google was making a change, or considering making a change, to how they to how information is I guess put forward through their searches. They were saying, you know what, maybe it's not a bad idea if we actually use accuracy in information and give it a higher relevancy in searches as opposed to just doing it according to what gets the most hits. And I had made the casual comment that certain people or channels or groups might be disappointed with that. Among them, I listed creationism, I listed Thunderfoot, and you took exception to that. You were most put out, it seemed, by that, and it generated from there into a discussion on feminism and the men's rights movement. And at that point, I suggested, well, rather than continuing to fight about this in the limited format that is Twitter, where it's very easy to have misunderstandings because you try to put everything in as concise a way as possible, but as a result you tend to generalize. It might be better if we moved it to some other format, which is how this came about, for those who are listening and wondering.
Well, that's certainly admirable. Quantum, is that your understanding? What was your position on that topic that began the initial discussion? If you could elaborate.
Well, I guess my contention was that someone like Thunderfoot be simply placed in the same category as perhaps a creationist or someone with a broadly irrational belief, simply for what I would consider expressing different political views on something like gender politics, especially considering some of his notable scientific research. If nothing else, that should count in his favor.
Well, I have no problem with the research he does. My understanding is what science videos he does, they're actually not bad. I recall he did one on the road system. Somebody had developed some kind of a solar road panel, and my understanding of the video he did on that, it was actually not bad. But when I checked last, he doesn't have any kind of relevant degree when it comes to issues like philosophy, theology, psychology, sociology. So he really is literally just expressing his opinion, and the impression I've gotten from the videos I've seen of his is that it's really just a generalized opinion, and it's mostly just to cater to an audience that already has a preconceived bias about the topic at hand. A lot of people say he's an idiot on those topics. I don't think it's that he's an idiot. I think he's just catering to an audience. I think it's why he lists his work, especially that as entertainment, is because it is really just entertainment value you're talking about there. He doesn't get in depth on any of these topics at all. That was what I was actually talking about. I was talking about there's a kind of propaganda-esque kind of feel to the videos he does on gender issues, more so than anything else. That is reminiscent of that. I'm sorry, you go ahead. Speak. Yeah.
So I just find it difficult to know when to bring up a contention. Yeah. But the problem I have here is that you say that he doesn't have a degree in various things. I don't want, by the way, I don't want this conversation to be purely about Thunderfoot. I'm trying to broaden it out.
No, of course not. We'll move away from that quickly. I don't think he's actually that important in the discussion.
But I think this is an important point to touch on. I mean, for instance, I spend a lot of time correcting climate change denialists on their rudimentary errors. And the way I think this works is I have a certain amount of basal knowledge of climate science, for instance. It's not enough for me to do original research in the subject, but it's enough to correct people that know less than I do about the subject. So I don't think it's necessary to obtain a high level of education if all you're merely doing is correcting people that are more ignorant about the subject than you are yourself. So this is why on YouTube atheists are able to criticise people like creationists or indeed climate change deniers, those sorts of people, without having degrees in theology or physics or whatever the relevant subject would be, because these people will actually know less than you would.
Now, I'd agree with that, but what you're saying there, the one caveat I'd put to that, though, is the examples he's putting forward, and this isn't just him, by the way, now we're kind of moving away from him, but a lot of the examples that are being put forward as representative of feminism, I find they're not very representative. For example, there's the video that made the rounds and made it into some of his videos and other people's videos of some the woman with red dyed hair yelling, and people said this is representative of feminism. Or they'll even say, and I'm just like, okay, well, who is she? What has she done? Oh, she's just some random woman yelling on the street. Well, I don't know how that exactly is representative of a number of centuries of of a movement like feminism. It's not really a fair comparison. Even when people, for example, mention Anita Sarkeesian, I'm like, well, she's just one person who actually overall doesn't, until recently at least, hasn't had much impact or effect on society, so I don't see how exactly she's representative of feminism. I look at somebody, for example, like Ruth Bader Ginsburg, I see her as highly representative of feminism. This is somebody who started the ACLU's Women's Rights Project, that has done a lot of great work. And when I see people doing continual videos over and over again on feminism, and they just keep referencing these essentially low-hanging fruit people, but they leave out everything else, it's not surprising that a lot of people online are getting this incredibly skewed perspective on what feminism is.
Okay, Philip, I think that's fair. So as we make the transition to talking about something like climate change, something that is objectively verifiable, now we move into something like gender politics. These are political ideologies. So with that being said, maybe we can't come to an objective understanding of a political ideology, but we can at least start by defining our terms, so that we're not getting confused. What is representative of feminism? How would you define that term? And then we can see if Quantum accepts or rejects it.
Well, for me, I would come from the school that feminism represents a fight for gender equality through focusing on the issues that, in this case, women face as minorities. Specifically, I focus more on legal issues. That's always been really the area when you say objective, that's why I find that it's interesting, because there are things that are hard to pin down objectively, but when you get into just straight out the law and what the law says, then you can get into some fairly objective areas about what is and is not discrimination. So I have a tendency when I have these conversations to focus more specifically on the legal aspect of it. And you see in feminism a lot of the fighting that has been done for gender equality has included cases that involve discrimination against men. If you even go back as far as 1972, some of the earliest cases of the Women's Project involved for example, it was the 10th Circuit, I think, who did a case with Mr. Moritz, where he was trying to take a deduction for taking care of his mother, but he could not get that tax deduction because traditionally that deduction only went to a woman or you know, somebody who was somebody female, either the wife or the mother or somebody taking care of that relative. That's a case that went forward that they won, where now that deduction was no longer just given to women, but it was given to men as well. And that's a classic example of gender equality, of feminism fighting for gender equality for both men and women, and not just in looking for rights for women, but in also equaling the bar, so to speak, where, you know what, this is a case where a woman has a right that's superior to a man, and it shouldn't be that way.
Okay, point taken. Quantum, do you have any objections with that gender equity definition?
Well, yes. I think there's a mismatch in communication that often goes on here. When people describe or argue against feminism, I think most people are very clearly understand what they mean. And given the context, I think people clearly understand the sort of people that we're arguing against, the sort of people that are, I guess, more radical. I don't think it's necessary to keep on drumming down the fact that you're always talking about the moderates, because it's obvious given the context. So I mean, I take a very dim view of using language and labels to a sort of semantic reductionist way of doing things. I just think it's pointless to get all worked up with a label. So I don't really have an issue if you want to describe me as a feminist just because I believe in equal opportunity for men and women. I mean, on this point, I think the vast majority of people do. So that begs the question that if the vast majority of people do believe in this, which I think is not an unfair thing to say, then why do we need this entire ism around that surrounds it? It's not. It shouldn't. It's not. It's an entirely uncontroversial thing. And the way I see it, the reason that there is this sort of political ideology around it is because there is some additional baggage that is tapped onto this. It isn't just equality for men and women. If it was, I think the only people that would be arguing against it are the sort of very traditionalist type sect of people. Perhaps some of the men's rights activists, perhaps. And on that point, actually, it's interesting that a lot of people would describe the men's rights activists in this sort of monolithic way. But when people do it in terms of feminism, it sort of is fairly jarring. So I see a fundamental inconsistency here. My personal view is I really don't care what people choose to call themselves. It really doesn't bother me at all. I think it's far easier to express yourself in more than one single word. But what I do see is that when people describe themselves as feminists, they tend to invest more in a certain paradigm of political views that someone that doesn't describe themselves as feminist would. So, for instance, as a general rule, feminists tend to be fairly left-wing. I mean, this is not really important in itself, but it's fairly common. You can get right-wing feminists, economically speaking, of course, but it's somewhat rare. So I think there is this political baggage that comes with it, and that's the main thing that I would be arguing against. And also, given that there are plenty of people that clearly support equality for men and women but don't call themselves feminists, I don't think these are mutually exclusive.
Fair enough. So, Philip, when we're talking about terms like this, we are talking about self-applied labels. There is no purity test for a term like feminist. So when somebody like Anita comes along and is, as you've said, low-hanging fruit, is it not inconsistent to go after them and their inconsistencies in their arguments in the same way somebody might go after a prominent men's rights figure?
Well, in the first place, when I described her as low-hanging fruit, it wasn't so much that her ideas I think are bad. I'm only so familiar with all of her ideas. It's more that she's really just expressing opinion, is my understanding of it. I've never understood why people obsess on her so much. She does videos and does talks where she expresses her opinions about, I guess it's predominantly video games, is the genre she focuses on. And I never really understood why people were so offended. They treat her as if she's giving some kind of scientifically valid argument when she really isn't. So, but I'm sorry, could you repeat the question? I got distracted by the idea of thinking of Anita Sarkeesian as low-hanging fruit.
Sure, well, perhaps allow me to rephrase it because it wasn't a very pointed question. These are self-identified, self-applied labels. These are, can you see, to Quantum's point, how it can be not entirely useful to discuss who is a true and who isn't versus the actual ideological claims. And if somebody finds those claims unpersuasive, is that the same? Is what is left to do? Does that by default make them an anti-feminist or just a not yet feminist? Or if you apply the label of feminist because they accept the term equality, where does it go for you?
Well, that's like you said, it's really kind of a self-applied thing. I try not to get too into label fights. For example, I've had people start arguments with me about whether Christina Hoff Sommers could be considered a feminist. My only personal benchmark for whether somebody is a feminist or not is whether or not they're fighting for women's rights. Now that takes can be broadly defined of how you view that should be done. I know that there's a lot of schism in the feminist community right now over whether or not that fight for equal rights should be inclusive of a fight for men as well, or whether or not they should just fight. It should just be women fighting for women's rights, and that's what they should be focusing on. It's been pointed out to me, and they do have a point, that no other group out there, no other minority group, is actually expected to fight for the rights of another group. And with women, yet they've now, in fairness, they've done this somewhat to themselves, feminists, by at one point they decided, you know what, we can get men on board, and we can have men fight for gender rights.
Can I just bring one thing up? I mean, women aren't a minority group. I mean, in the vast majority of Western countries.
Well, are you talking numerically, or are you talking socially?
Well, in terms of population, in the vast majority of
no, in population-wise, they're not considered a minority group. They're considered a minority group because of essentially because of social mores and attitudes.
How so? Could you elaborate, Philip, in what way you feel women are? We would just try to sort of flesh out positive in your position.
Well, would you say it's fair to say that women have been, as far as power goes, a minority group at some point in history, like even recently in the past 100 or so years? Do you take dispute with that, or is the idea overall of women being a minority group, or is it just you take dispute at the idea of them still as of recently being a minority group because of changes that have happened in society, or Western society specifically?
Well, I really thought minority group just meant that they're the minority in terms of population. I mean, that's all I thought. I mean, if you go to an Islamic country, I guess, and you're white, then you would be a minority.
Whereas it's used. I don't know how it's used over where you are. It's used kind of generally over here. And you're right. It can be confusing in that sense. It's usually used as a catch-all term to refer to any group which doesn't have a power compared to other groups.
So, Quantum, based on his assertion there, or at least his question to you, would you agree that women have been deprived of that in the position that he's referring to throughout history, or what is your response to his question?
Well, in the past, of course, it was far more clear cut. Having said that, I mean, it wasn't just women that were deprived. I mean, the vast majority of people were deprived of power. And I mean, even when you consider the First World War, I guess I would have rather been a woman. I mean, you could argue. I guess some feminists would argue that you don't have the privilege of going off to fight. But I mean, I don't think it's privilege. I think being killed in a war is sort of. But anyway, just discounting all these sort of issues I have with that. If we go to a sort of modern type Western civilization, the problem is far less difficult for me to get my head around. And in that case, I would say that no, I don't really think there is any sort of power difference between men and women in a modern type Western civilization. That's not to say in other parts of the world that there aren't. I wouldn't deny that I mean, there are some countries where that is definitely the case, but if we restrict our view to somewhere like Western Europe or North America, then it becomes easier.
So it's funny. I have to comment. It's funny that you made the statement about I don't consider it a privilege to go off to fight in a war, but consistently you see in our literature and in how our society reacts to the military that apparently there is definitely a large portion of our society that feels that way. You look at the history of the Civil War in America, and there was a huge fight between the African American populace, the black populace, and the white populace over whether or not they could serve in the military. They wanted to serve in the military. They wanted to serve equally. But they weren't allowed to serve, and then when they finally were allowed to serve, they weren't allowed to serve equally. They got paid $3 less than a white soldier, who got $13, and then on top of that, they got charged $3 for their equipment, which white soldiers didn't have to pay. So you have to wonder, I always wonder when people make that statement, it's like, yeah, I understand where you're coming from when you say that. And it's funny because for me, like I feel how you do now. I would not want to go off to fight in a war, but I was actually raised in a family that had military people in it. And when I was younger, I would have considered it something of a privilege to go off to fight in a war, because that was the environment I was raised in. I was raised in an environment where it was considered not only just a duty, but an honor to go and do that.
I mean, in the First World War, that was very much the case. Although I would say that people weren't pressured to sign up, obviously. But when you did, it was considered. It was indeed considered a great honour. But by the time you got to the back end of the First World War,
oh yeah,
after the
and
case,
World War
after
II
the
as
case
well.
and stuff.
Yeah,
But
both of them were terrible wars, and the
Yeah.
attrition, the human life attrition, was terrible. And it's interesting because despite that, we still have a culture, especially among men, of just viewing military service as something that's it's dying off now, I think. But until recently, we've had a culture of just considering military service to be something special and unique. I have a military coat I wear. It's an antique Navy Academy coat, and I ran into a 80-year-old woman the other day at the doctor's, and she asked me, she said, you know, that coat, that's from the Navy? And I said, yes, it is. And she says, where did you get it? And I said, my wife got it for me. And she said, oh, well, I earned mine. So, and the way she said it, it was very clear that there was this attitude of that she was proud that she had earned the right to wear the coat that she had, and she felt that I didn't necessarily have the right to wear that coat. So even to this day, we still have that attitude, and even women will express it. So I'm sorry, I had to sidebar that. I just found
that's an interesting aside. So Philip, it sounds like where Quantum remains deeply unconvinced is the assertion that we can go back and forth about the past circumstances, but at present today, it doesn't seem like Western women are systematically deprived. There doesn't seem to be any systematic forces depriving women institutionally. This is where it sounds like Quantum is deeply unconvinced, and he can correct me if I'm wrong. If I am correct, what sort of instances could you give to anybody who shares that same view?
Well, I look at the abortion debate in America, and that alone strikes me as a clear example of women being attempted to have them deprived of rights. Another example outside of abortion, you've been following the Walmart case, the Dukes versus Walmart case? You might not be aware of that. There was a case brought against Walmart in America by a number of women who claimed that they were being hit with unfair hiring, pay, and promotion practices. And they presented a number of examples of evidence which, if they proved to be true, would be quite compelling, that showed that they were being treated this way predominantly just for being women, with a lot of the old-fashioned kind of, you know, women should really be, you know, at home in the kitchen, and you're here, and you know you have kids, and that should be more your focus. So you shouldn't have to make as much money as a man does. Things like that, which by the way, I find it interesting that people don't believe that kind of thing happens when we have a society like an American society where about 25% of our society is still highly religious. And our society is highly driven by religion, especially when it comes to business. I'm always surprised when I'm at a conference, because I work in the technical field, engineering, and I'm at a conference. Not that I'm an engineer, mind you, I don't misrepresent what I am, but you're at a conference. You're surrounded by PhDs, by people with masters. These are people who are they represent power in industry. Gas, oil, water, sewage treatment, you name it. These are the guys who run the country. And the speaker will take a moment and pause in the middle of talking about the product or whatever it is they're talking about, and he'll take a moment to thank God. He'll say, you know what, I want to thank God that we are here and that we have the opportunities we have to do what we are doing here today. And everybody stands up and applauds, and they applaud. And it's shocking. It's amazing to realize that this kind of religion in this country still plays such a strong part in it, in everything that happens. And I look at that and I say, how can you look at, for example, what the women of Walmart are saying is happening, and how can you say, you know what, I don't believe that's happening. I don't believe there are people who still have those old Judeo-Christian attitudes when it comes to what women and men are supposed to be and what they're supposed to do. But this case is, for me, a great example of how the anti-feminist perspective and how their worldview can be very damaging to American society, not just women, but all of our rights. Because if you follow the case, what happened is they brought a class action lawsuit, because that's what you do in that kind of circumstance when you have people from different states, different stores. And the judge, for better or worse, dismissed the case. He didn't dismiss it because he felt that the case was unwarranted. He dismissed it because he raised the specter that it's not right that people who are suffering different harms according to what they're going through should all be given an equivalent judgment. So therefore, he said the case should be broken up and they should each take the case individually to individual courts, on local each state jurisdiction. Which if you know anything about how the law works and class action lawsuits work, it's a hugely problematic to the rights of the individual in the society to stand up to large entities like somebody like Walmart, because it's very difficult to do. It's expensive. You have very little chance of success. That's an example of where the negative attitude towards feminism in our society is causing some detrimental results in individual rights. Because I have to wonder, if it wasn't a case about women's rights, would people be making more noise about this? Would they be more upset about it? Would they be saying, you know what, no, we can't have this?
Well,
those are two examples. I mean, I'm going to stop because I've talked for a while. So.
Sure, no, I could appreciate the first example goes to a little bit more, and perhaps that's my fault for not making it point there enough again, but I'm sort of looking for, and I think Quantum might be as well, for a more systematic example. We're talking about institutional systemic forces depriving women based solely by virtue of the fact that they are women. The first one would be, if we conceded that, would be an example of a female-only deprivement of rights. Can you give other examples other than sort of? I'm not sure that I'm not saying that the Walmart example isn't valid.
Just before he does, and yes, that would be one of my points. But another point that I think is quite interesting in this thing is that when you engage with a sort of feminism ideology, you very rarely hear feminists targeting things like religion, because obviously I completely agree that religion is sexist. I mean, almost all religions are sexist. Mm-hmm. And you yourself highlighted that religion was the main cause of this particular debacle. But it's something that you very rarely hear about. Instead, you hear about things like the patriarchy. What you don't hear about is the damage that religion is actually doing. So that's just an interesting point. But I think I do
understand. For me, a lot of people might not know this, but I came from a conservative background, Judaic background. So I grew up going to the type of religious temple, shul, where you had the men sat on one side, the women sat on the other, and never the twain shall meet, because that's just how the religion worked. So when you have a Judaic background like that, it's extremely patriarchal. And I had the additional unique perspective where we had originally come from a reasonably conservative background, but my family, for the most part, our religion was more, not to say that we didn't believe, but it was more really of a social tool for us to get by in society. So this is back during the 1980s. You have to understand, when we had this is New York City. There was a lot of strife between the Jewish and the black community, and my family was one of the families that took part in what was considered a very mini diaspora, where they fled the city, they fled Brooklyn, and they went out to Long Island, where they formed a community there of Jews. But the problem they had was that there weren't enough Jewish people in the area of the same type of religious background to actually invest in and purchase the property and to run a temple. You had a certain number of Reform, a certain number of Conservative, a certain number of Orthodox. So they had to come up with the unique solution of sharing. So I came from a conservative background, but I got continual daily interaction with the Orthodox and the Reform, along with our conservative group, and it gave me a unique perspective on what patriarchy is. And I have to say, you're right, it's very difficult to look at our society today and see examples of any kind of widespread, systematic example of patriarchy. I think in large part, the influence it has is it's more residual. We're a very plutocratic capitalist society, and I think you see it more in how it plays out there, where you're looking for any excuse, as for example as a business owner or as somebody who has the money and the power, and you're looking for an excuse to justify what you do. You know, why you say, you know what, I want to keep what I have and I don't want other people to have more than they should have. And then all of a sudden, when you have a society where predominantly. Look at, for example, I hate to go back to just one example, but you look in the law, predominantly, especially when you get into the higher positions, it's predominantly white men. Women are not very represented.
Yeah.
And they're more represented, I have to say, than African American, which they're very not represented. And at that point, you sit there and you have people who are saying, well, they're not there because they don't want to be in those positions. And you have to say, well, can you say that about the African Americans too? Do they not want to be in positions of power?
Quantum.
I have to wonder if there's really any truth to that, or if maybe
Quantum wanted to interject in that point.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I encourage you guys to go back and forth with each other as point by point. So, Quantum, you were not convinced of the. You said it's predominantly white men.
Yeah. Well. Okay. I'm not ruling out that there is some discrimination, but the studies that I've looked at suggest that it's very, very difficult to isolate quantitatively how much there is. Because it's a quantity that's very, very difficult to measure. But what is easier to measure is you can look at other causes that are easier to measure. And what is true is that there are certain ways, usually involving human capital, where you can lower things like the power disparity by changing certain variables. So that says to me that even if it is not 100% due to non-discriminatory factors, there must be some large part that is due to non-discriminatory factors. And what I see is people that are unwilling to even accept this. I mean, this goes, I guess, this goes all back to biology, and it seems to me that there's an analogy between, for instance, creationists refuse to accept evolution because we evolved from apes, so we behave like apes, sort of thing, and that was their rationale. But that they didn't want to accept evolution because because they didn't want to be reduced to being an ape. And I see something similar, that we don't want to accept that there are physiological differences between men and women that go up to including psychological differences, which impact things like choice, that sort of thing. And we don't want to accept that because of some fear of sexism, just like the Christians feared being compared to apes. We might fear being accused of things like sexism, and it isn't sexist if it's true. And well, we could argue this point, but I
have an easy way of addressing this. All you have to do is look at the statistics over time for how, from you go back, let's say, to, I don't want to go back too far because I try not to do that historically, because you can go all back to 1875 when the first women were trying to become lawyers, but they weren't allowed to become lawyers because they had the courts, making decisions, for example, saying that women aren't suited to not only the battlefield that is the courtroom, but also the battlefield that is the real life battlefield of war, so therefore they shouldn't be there. But at that point, that's around when women started getting into the law, when they started being allowed to work as lawyers. From that point on, there's been overall an increase to where women represent about 33% to this day of the number of lawyers in America, which isn't bad. I know a lot of feminists, a lot of women will say, oh, it should be higher. Like you look at Ruth Bader Ginsburg and her famous statement for when we will have true equality is she says when we have four, I think it was we have four more female judges on the Supreme Court, but so you have an increase to 30% or 33% over time. That tells me that there's really not a physiological reason for why that's happening. That had to be more of a cultural, societal thing, because obviously women are gradually gravitating over time to it. But then look, for example, at the secretarial field. The secretarial field, since before then probably, has always been dominated by women. Now, even with the 1970s, with the women's rights movement and the changes to how men are viewed in society, you had the stay-at-home dad movement, which started in the 80s after the recession, and men are no longer just like pigeonholed to that degree where they have to be that kind of bread earner. But even with all that, you see that there's been virtually no increase in the number of men in the secretarial field. Now, can you look at one and say, well, that obviously there isn't necessarily a physiological reason for why that's happening? Is that the case with the other? You have to ask yourself, is it men aren't going into that field because there's a physiological reason they can't be secretaries? Or is it just because it's not viewed as an attractive field for men to be in for some cultural reason.
That's a fair question, Quantum. To his point, you can't deny that there's inequality of outcome in some of these professions. What, if anything, do you think that implies?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I just did miss a small amount because the phone unfortunately rang. But
I'm sorry.
Sorry, it's my fault. I think I got most of it there. So I think one point that you're referring to is the fact that things like the wage gap or power differences have shrank. I mean, that's demonstrably true. Is that part of your point that they've shrunk? Okay. Well, one interesting thing here is, and I will point out that there are several reasons for this, and one reason is yes. The discrimination clearly existed in the past, and I wouldn't deny that, and that clearly has gone away. But there are also other reasons, and one reason would be because traditionally the sort of jobs that were available maybe 100 years ago or even 50 years ago tended to be more manual labour, and given that we have more technology now, I shouldn't really have to explain why. And the fact
the Industrial Revolution was a great equalizer when it came to.
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, the thing was that manual labour was worth a lot more in the past than it is now. So it stands to reason that since things like manual labour are worth less nowadays than they were in the past, that you are going to expect things like these gaps to reduce. And keep in mind as well that there is going to be a lag. So let's say everything is completely equal now. There is going to, of course, be a lag. So, I mean, people that are 60, 65 years old are clearly probably still going to be working. And if they had the advantages when they started working 40 years ago, those advantages haven't gone away, even if, let's assume, for the sake of argument, we are an egalitarian society. So there is this lag time that you've also got to take into account as well. So even if nothing was done at all, there's every possibility that these sorts of gaps would continue to reduce just naturally over time because of this lag that we haven't caught up with yet. So, I mean, I think that addresses the main gist of your point. Do you have any issues with that?
Well, I'm a little unclear. Are you basically saying that because of the work that's come before, that essentially we're gradually reaching a state where things like, for example, the wage gap are no longer going to be an issue?
Well, there's going to be a convergence point sometime in the future. I mean, we're already seeing some signs of this now. I don't know what this convergence point is actually going to be. I suspect it will be somewhat under. I don't think it's going to converge to a 1-to-1 ratio, but it is going to converge to something, and we haven't reached equilibrium point yet. But I think even if we did nothing now, assuming that society doesn't degrade in subsequent years, I think we will get close to this equilibrium point.
But one of the issues we have, especially in American society, one of the problems we have right now is due to a loss of collective bargaining power. I think people don't take into account one of the reasons the wage gap is in certain fields and areas becoming closer. It's not that necessarily women are gaining more rights when it comes to wage. I think it's that overall wages are being depressed, especially for men, especially when you consider the recession we just came out of. You look at somebody like what's his name, Governor Scott, I believe, who compared unions to ISIS. He's like, oh, I can take on ISIS, put me on it. It's like I took out the unions, and you begin to see that. This is one of those examples where I really wish the anti-feminists didn't take the tack they do when it comes to fighting this kind of thing, because I think it's detrimental overall to these kinds of rights. Like for example, you've heard it referred to as the wage gap myth, have you not? Do you take exception to the use of the word myth with that? Because I've heard that used consistently by the many leaders in the men's rights movement. And I always found that to be a bizarre word to use, because myth suggests it never existed, and yet they do this, and yet they use it in reference to that.
Yeah, again, this comes back to my. I mean, I really struggle to find myself overly concerned with the terminology used. What I'm more concerned about is the evidence that backs it up. So it doesn't really matter to me whether someone uses the word myth or not. If they can explain themselves and give reasons for a point of view, that's really all I care about. Unfortunately, I'm completely apathetic to this issue.
And on the national level, a lot of what we decide is basically driven by sound bites. Okay, I understand what you're saying as far as like in a discussion like this. I can see where you'd be like, I don't really care about labels, but labels, I have to say, labels actually play an important part in how we communicate with each other, especially on a large scale and on a large scale platform. It makes a real difference as to how we label things, because it skews the perspective overall of how society views things. So when you use a word like myth in reference to something, like okay, let me give you an example that you can fully understand. Look at the what we call, well, what they prefer to, they call the evolution versus creation debate, but we don't call it that because it's really not a debate. You may not remember, but you go back maybe 10, 15 years, there really wasn't a debate on this topic, but they came up with the expression "teach the controversy." Those three words, "teach the controversy," have been more detrimental and more damaging to our society and to how we fund and view science than anything else I can possibly think of that has happened. God, the only thing I can think of as a comparison is the climate change debate, which you brought up, where they've used similar tactics, where, the example, they said climate change and they put a question mark next to it, in front of, climate change with a question mark, and then they put that out all over the place. That little change put through our media, throughout society, on a continual basis, hammering that over and over for year after year, has created an environment where all of a sudden climate change isn't taken seriously. People actually treat it as if it's some kind of like boogeyman thing that's just being used to take away what they have. We have political groups in our country. We have a Senate that actually ruled that you can't even reference climate change. You can't use climate change scientists when discussing climate change. We got things like that going on. So terminology actually does really matter when it comes to addressing the public. You really have to be very specific in how you say it and aware that what people say makes a real difference in what they get across.
I have two points to this. Firstly, it's worth noting that this sort of thing is inevitable. I mean, political point scoring. The reason climate change denial is typically a conservative view. I mean, my politics are conservative, but obviously I'm not a climate change denier. Although,
I'm sorry. What country are you from, by the way?
I'm from the UK. Although it should be actually fairly interesting that I did used to be a climate change denier. So it's very true that certain forms of pseudoscience align themselves to different political views. I don't think it's a coincidence that my political view aligns itself to climate change denial, and I was once a climate change denier. So first of all, there is an inevitability about this. It doesn't matter if someone uses the term wage gap myth and then may perhaps provides a load of evidence and backs that up. That isn't going to change anything. If someone wants the wage gap to be a myth, it's going to be a myth anyway from their political standpoint. And secondly, I would like to move the sort of the kickback effect, which is fairly interesting. So one example would be the debate between the GM crew and the anti-GM crew. Okay, so in general, we can all agree that GM is a pretty positive thing, right? But there's the phenomenon that when you debate rather ferociously against people that are, for instance, very anti-GM, it can actually cause your position to change as well. You actually become more pro-GM than would be objectively reasonable. So someone arguing against anti-GM would likely, their own position would likely to become more extreme. So for instance, someone that's pro-GM would argue that there are no disadvantages of GM at all, which is false. There are some disadvantages. For instance, if they get into the natural environment, they can outcompete things that are already there. So even though GM is largely a good thing, when you argue against people that are against it, you can actually make your own position more extreme. And this is something that I do see with feminism. The feminists don't help themselves at all. The reason that there's such a kickback against it is because there's this great big bundle of irrationality on their side. So first of all, you're gonna get terms like myth used anyway. That's going to happen. But secondly, they are not helping themselves because their position is irrational. So obviously you're going to get this effect where people come in and make their own positions more extreme and use. I mean, I would, I guess, be opposed to the word myth if I really cared. Again, I don't see any help. I don't see the feminists particularly helping on this issue.
What about their position as irrational, Quantum? Is there anything in particular? Is the whole idea flawed, or could you elaborate on that?
Well, as a political ideology, we continuously see it getting more and more extreme. This is why I fail to believe that
Well, I think
it has something to
that's
do with.
partly because of the internet.
Yeah, okay, but it's not just the internet. It's getting into mainstream politics now. You can, in the UK government, you can see it all the time. Well, for instance, we have this sort of idea that you get points, you get sort of kudos for just including people that are arbitrarily of a greater diversity or something, and you can make a completely flippant remark, and you can be sacked for some sort of ism or whatever, even though the context, when looking at the context, the mark is completely non-derogatory. So, for instance, making a joke that involves skin colour, for example, would be considered much worse than calling someone an idiot to their face, and I don't quite understand that. If the joke, is completely benign, it shouldn't matter whether the joke is about skin colour or not. It's just that there's I don't know. This sort of hypersensitivity and overt political correctness is something that I see being paraded by these sort of feminism agenda. The sort of kickback against it doesn't exactly help either, because it does sometimes go too far the other way. But this is not going to end until people can sit down and be objective about this, and to not be censored. You can even get into a situation where you can't even link to scientific studies showing, for instance, there's a study that has a large number of participants that shows differences in the brain structure between men and women. And if you were to even link to that paper, you could be even sacked for sexism or something like that. This is something that really isn't helping anyone. If we're objective and just look at the evidence clearly, I don't think there's. I think everyone would find that this whole situation becomes better. I think there's a lot of scaremongering going on here.
You seem to have a different political climate in the UK than we do over here in America, where when it comes to anti-women or anti-feminist rhetoric, there's a lot of leeway given over here when it comes to that. It's why the MRAs have been so successful. Between the internet and that, they've been able to grow rapidly, basically just spouting a lot of hate. A lot of their I have to say, a lot of their positions are irrational. They have a tendency to hijack other minority issues to make them their own, so that they can promote their own agenda. In fairness to them, you have to remember they are.
Can I just ask you a really brief question? Sorry for interrupting. Can I just ask you a question about the MRA? Yeah. Does the MRA have any I see things like the international thing for women. We have a women's MP, that sort of thing. Does the MRA actually have any sort of political power? Is there like a government body of men's rights?
That's a tricky question. That's a tricky question, because initially I guess the National Coalition for Men, if you go back to I think they formed in like the late 1970s, early 80s. They've never really had any significant power, but at the same time, you're talking about American culture, American society, where men, overall, especially for, I know it'll piss a lot of people off, but white men, they haven't had a lot of issues. It wasn't until like the 90s when the entire child custody issue became kind of problematic for a small percentage of society. It really that's one of the things that I should point out for both men and women here, that a lot of the issues that come up in these areas tend to really especially impact negatively on the poor. When you talk about, for example, child custody disputes and men being put in jail for not being able to pay their child support, you tend to be predominantly talking about a poorer section of society that this is happening to. Unfortunately, over the past decade, they've actually they're starting to do some remedying of that situation, but it really does need to be worked on some more. But otherwise, the recent men's rights movement that's come about after the prior National Coalition for men's rights movement, they really don't have any political power, although it's interesting to see that a lot of what they say has been gradually making it into the right-wing mainstream media. or political sources. They're getting quoted more and more frequently. So saying they don't have power is kind of a tricky thing, because on the one hand, they're a group that traditionally in the past were considered liberal, but on the other hand, a lot of what they spout nowadays in their new incarnation is very appealing to the religious right, the conservative right in this country. So I don't think they necessarily have power exactly, but they are building a power base by saying things that appeal to those people.
But I mean, okay. So if we take the US, I mean, I've been following some stories about this. Of course, you can say the same for the sort of feminist groups, and they do already have power.
They have a lot of power, absolutely. Yeah,
but one thing
in some ways they do, in some ways they don't.
I mean, one thing that struck me about America, I mean, and this is from living in the UK. I mean, I know there's obviously an issue with confirmation bias, that sort of thing. You see the things that you're more interested in. But I've seen stories, or a lot of stories from American universities in particular, where people have been, sacked, being chucked out of universities for fairly trivial things.
The American universities have an issue when it comes to gender politics. That's the one area where I would agree it's not being dealt with well. You heard about the case of the woman who's going around carrying a mattress because she claimed she was raped, and she felt she couldn't get justice, so she started going about the campus carrying her mattress. And have you heard of that? You know what I'm talking about?
I mean, I was thinking of a case where a guy, I don't know whether he was kicked out, but he was at least barred from going to various places in the university.
Yes,
simply because he reminded someone of their rapist or something. So he just happened to have a passing resemblance to what that person looked like. He hadn't committed any crime at all. He just happened to look like someone that had.
Yeah, the universities are not handling these issues well at all. The problem you have, like for example, with the case I named, or I didn't name, I actually just referenced, it's not just her rights that are being infringed on, it's his as well. They should address it properly. If necessarily, it should be taken to a court of law, something like that. The way they handle it is terrible, because what you end up with is two people who are unsatisfied, neither of them getting justice. She's not getting to face the person who she feels that she has been wronged by in a court of law. He is being tried in the court of public opinion, which is going to be detrimental to him in the future, should he try to go to any other university, should he try to possibly even get a job, because he doesn't get the satisfaction of being able to face his accuser and have the charges dealt with. And that's just like overall just representative of what's going on in the American universities.
The thing is, though, I mean, I really don't hear this sort of rational tone that you're presenting me with now. I don't really hear this very often in feminist circles at all. I mean, how?
Oh, I don't know.
Look at the various media outlets and how they've been reporting this. I mean, if you wrote an article for them and said what you've said now, I would be a lot happier, because this is not the sort of thing that I'm hearing.
Well,
I mean, you come across as being very rational at the when
the problem with what you're hearing is that it's being driven by by two movements that are basically polarized at this point. When I recall when I first came on YouTube 5 years ago, feminist issues were discussed, but they weren't really discussed with that much frequency. They didn't get that much attention. And then the MRAs came on YouTube. They came on the internet. They exploded onto the scene. A lot of feminists tried to interact with them in a positive way. I was one of them, because I'm coming from the position of that more, I guess you would call, I hate to say old style feminist, because it makes it sound like our day is come and gone, but we're still here. We're not dead, for the love of God. It's like, we're not gone. Don't put us in the grave yet. We like the idea of working with men, and I was on not just women's issues, but men's issues, and I was like, this is a wonderful way to do this. But unfortunately, they were hell-bent on taking an anti-feminist tact, on portraying feminism in the worst possible way they could, in any manner possible, and it made it impossible to work with them. And as a result, what happened is they focused entirely on, as you would say, either low-hanging fruit or people who did things that were easy to pick out and go, look at the crazy person doing what she's doing. And as a response back, those people got a lot more attention than they should have. And they responded back in kind, and you basically got a gender war of escalation going on. And that's why, if I sound reasonable to you, somebody like me isn't going to really get a lot of attention, because this is the internet where attention is paid to things on a moment-by-moment basis, and therefore whatever is the most extreme and outrageous is what's going to get attention.
Philip, could it be the case that possibly, and not to direct us at you, also to Quantum with regards to his beliefs, could it be that you are both more moderate, reasonable, rational forms of your ideologies, or I'm not sure if Quantum has proposed an ideology, perhaps just a lack thereof. Could it be the case that the reason that we're not hearing from more people like you is it just simply that they are being drowned out by the louder, more irrational people, or if that's the case, then how have they?
I don't think they're being drowned out. I think it's more just that's what's getting all the attention.
But you can't, and it has gotten quite a bit of attention.
I don't think they're a majority. I think it's like, I remember. Okay, just to go back to do the way back machine again for memories. I don't know if you remember somebody by the name of Nuclear Knight on YouTube. This is somebody who had almost no viewership, no following. She was, I guess you would call her a radical feminist. I don't remember entirely her views. I just remember they were kind of radical. And then the YouTube content provider by the name of I believe it was The Amazing Atheist, large channel, had about 300,000 subscribers at the time. He found her and he did a video on her. This channel, this person who nobody knew anything about, nobody for the most part cared about outside of their feminist circle. She had maybe 100 subscribers. She became a Reddit internet sensation overnight. And that really that defines the story of what has happened to feminism and gender politics on the internet. It's been this continual hunt for finding anything that looks out of the ordinary and extreme and raising it up to the attention of everybody else so they can focus on it and making that appear as if it's the norm, when in fact it's not. And I've had frustrating conversations. It's why I kind of gave up on talking to people in the men's rights movement. I've had numerous frustrating conversations with them where I tried to explain this. I tried to have reasonable, rational discussions with them, but they're not interested in hearing it. Because, unfortunately, the business model they're using overall is one of, like look at their expression, fuck your shit up. That's the defining expression of like some of the major leaders of the men's rights movement right there. That's not the expression of somebody who's saying they want to have a rational, reasonable debate. It's kind of like almost like a Cy 10 Brugengate kind of thing. Because if you look at like him or Eric Hovind, what they do is they try to piss you off. They want to piss you off right out the gate so that you'll be arguing from a position of emotion so that you will not be able to logically and rationally respond to what they say. Because they know if you actually get into a rational, logical discussion with them, they'll lose. And that's the same thing that's happening here. Now I can't say if this is happening with feminists as well. I don't interact with the feminist community that much on YouTube. I have had some interaction with some of the skeptics and whatnot. They seem like decent people. They didn't strike me as extreme in any way. I was on that One Magic Sandwich show, for example, with I can't remember their names. There's a couple of the skeptics, and we had a debate about abortion. And at the time, I personally felt that she didn't present her idea as well. We talked about it afterwards, and she acknowledged that she didn't feel she didn't present her idea as well. But the problem is, like, you look at what happened afterwards, is she was portrayed as being some kind of crazy person. I don't think she was a crazy person. I just think she was caught off guard.
I remember that one. I think I was actually briefly on that episode.
Oh, were you?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Very briefly. I came on towards the end. But what struck me there is that there were definitely two camps. But for instance, I remember.
By the way, that show was instrumental in my change of position on abortion rights. I actually was in the camp with the Iron and the others with the 6 months. But after a lot of philosophical and legal inquiry after that show, it led me to the position I have now, which is an entirely rights-based position, which is, it comes more from the libertarian side of my social.
I mean, if we took someone from that show, like, I don't know, because Thunderfoot was on that show.
Yes, he was.
But I remember his position was not radical in any way. He seemed to be advocating for the status quo. I think that his position would be fairly similar to mine. So where it's legal after a certain point, sorry, before a certain point, and that's I mean, you may disagree with that position yourself, but
well, you're coming from the UK. You have a different level of rights when it comes to personal rights than we do here. I think, is that correct?
Can you just ask that again?
The impression I get is that we have like certain aspects of our Constitution that grant certain rights that I don't know if you necessarily have it written in such a specific way in what you have.
Yeah.
Where for us, for example, like if I was arguing the abortion issue in another country, the arguments I present would not necessarily work because mine are fundamentally tied to the American Constitution, the 14th Amendment, the right to personal privacy that we have. And,
okay, I mean, but I mean, from what I can remember, he was advocating for a UK. I mean, I don't really know what the abortion laws are in the US, but I know what they are in the UK. And
they're getting worse and worse here. We're basically losing the rights. So it's.
But I mean, he seemed to be advocating for a system similar to what we have in the UK. Now, I can't help thinking that there would be a different reaction, perhaps, if I presented his opinion now. Because this is a fairly reasonable and rational conversation. And don't forget, we started off with the whole putting him into a different camp. I mean, my views aren't that far away from Thunderfoot's, and I can't help thinking that you know, it just seems that, like you said, I mean, like we've touched on earlier, there is this kickback effect where
well, you got to remember, okay, you have to remember that Thunderfoot's position, unfortunately, was based on a couple, for the large part, a lot of his position was based on an emotional reaction. He was arguing from emotion on some of it. In the first place, we're looking at the disputed term that he was arguing about was the last, essentially, 3 months. Because I can't remember her name. She had presented the position that you should have abortion up until right to the point. Well, she said you should have abortion the right entirely, right up, I guess, to the point of birth, and that language right there is problematic because when you reach past 6-7 months, it's not an abortion anymore. So right there, I was like, we're arguing on a position that doesn't actually really exist in the first place, which is why the conversation went downhill so fast. So right there, you're talking really abortion only happens up to about 6-7 months, and then after 7 months, you begin to get into premature birth. At that point, you're starting to get into that kind of territory. So I would say that the position that Thunderfoot was arguing for, I would say no, it doesn't really work because you're relying on certain concepts that aren't true. For example, abortion after 7 months, it's not common. It's not easy like people make it out to be. It's a serious medical procedure. It's not cheap. It's not taken on lightly. A doctor won't necessarily do it if they don't think it's not a medically valid thing to do. They're not just going to give it to you. It's not like going in and buying a candy bar. And frankly, it shifts the debate into this area where it doesn't really belong.
I can see it being as a sort of distractor. But
yeah, that was my problem with what he did, and I was caught off guard. It's why, and in fairness to me as well, I kind of been with Thunderfoot, you're not really in these talks. You're not supposed to get too heavily into feminism. It's almost kind of like a suggested thing because
even though it was a bit of a distraction, I think there is still utility in doing that. I mean, we have hypothetical situations for a reason. I think you can use them in order to test what people's political view is in a situation that's never going to happen, but it's still useful. It says something to me. If someone would be prepared to abort a fetus at 8 months, even though such a situation is never going to happen, that says something useful about their position. And I can understand why you would.
I think it's more that she was just being sloppy in her use of terminology. I think that the impression I got when we talked about it afterwards is that she had been caught off guard and she was just responding in a fashion, when she was unprepared. I'm trying to be generous because that's just the way it struck me. Just like I don't think Thunderfoot, for example, if you actually talk to him, I think he knows enough about biology that if you actually talk to him and you said, hey, you do realize that after 7 months it's actually not an abortion, I think he'd be like, oh yeah, sure, I'm not going to go, no, you said it's an abortion, you're an idiot. I'm not going to do that. I'm not that kind of douchebag. But, yeah, it's like for example, in the UK, do you have the same right where if you had a child who an already born child I'm talking about here, let's say a 3-month-old child, it needed a liver transplant. You can't, like, if the father or the mother, if they had the right blood, you know, they matched up, they can give the transplant, and they didn't want to give it, you can't force that transplant to happen, right? You can't force blood transfusions. You can't, like, you can't do that, right?
No, you can't.
Yeah, it's the same over here. So this is kind of like when we're getting into this kind of thing on the abortion issue. It's like, well, you can't do that. You can't force people to do things with their body on that level in these other areas. So therefore, as far as I'm concerned, it's you can't do it over there as well. It's really no different.
I think there is a slight difference there, because you can choose to become pregnant, and I think that is an important thing. I don't think that should be the standard.
The problem with that standard is you're kind of getting into the idea of, oh, well, then you chose to get pregnant, you chose for this to happen to yourself, and it kind of gets into a blame game thing. It does, and that's really not the issue here. It's like you don't choose to go out and get mugged, for example. It just happens. You might choose to go and do something which leads to you getting mugged. And even if you technically did choose to do it, it still doesn't change the fact that you still have the right to not be robbed. And it's a similar concept here. It's like it doesn't really matter whether or not you chose to do this thing. The fact of the matter is you do have the right to not be told what you do with your body to this degree.
Is that a valid comparison? I'm just playing devil's advocate here.
It's a difficult. Which one are we talking about?
With regards to mugging and having.
I don't know if it's a good comparison. I was kind of caught off guard, and I'm not sure.
Well, fair enough.
I prefer to stick to the medical ones, because once you go outside of the realm of medical, then all of a sudden you're getting into analogies, and I see a lot of bad analogies come up. Like once you get into areas of mugging and things like that, then you're starting to deal with the whole blame game thing, and that's the problem with doing it. Is, like you said, is that a valid comparison? I'm like, no, in a way it isn't, because choice doesn't really play into this matter as to whether or not it happening. It's basically, it's not a matter of what you chose that led up to it happening. The question is, now that it has happened, what rights do you have in that circumstance? What can the state do?
But the thing is, if you encourage a society where there's no personal responsibility, you do get unpleasant things happening. I mean, in terms of the pregnancy case, there are incidences of this is rare, but it has happened. Of women deliberately making themselves pregnant because of the hormonal changes that you undergo while you're pregnant. Your muscle mass tends to increase. So there are actually instances of Olympic athletes getting themselves pregnant deliberately to confer.
Yeah, but these are extreme cases. You can't.
They are extreme. They are
you can't make law. Any legislation made on extreme cases is always bad legislation. It's like the reactionary legislation we have here in the United States, where somebody gets brutally murdered, like somebody brutally murders a child. So they'll make a law where they'll do mandatory sentencing for child murders, let's say, or I don't know if this is a great example, but. And generally what happens when we do reactionary legislation in the United States, just of any kind, the end result is people end up getting harmed by it. It has a negative effect on the rest of society, because that's an extreme case and people are looking for some kind of, like, essentially vengeance. And the problem with a case like you're mentioning is it sounds to me like an extreme case. It doesn't come up frequently.
I accept that, but I don't think that the concept in general is extreme. I mean, if you take the point of view of a child, and we consider a scenario where people take absolutely no responsibility for things like pregnancy, perhaps a situation where you don't even use contraception at all. How is that going to affect some of the children that inevitably grow up? I mean, they're probably going to have worse lives.
What are you talking about, fetuses, or are you talking?
No, I'm talking about after they're born in this case. So I mean, I'm making a very broad general point here that in a society in general. You do want to encourage personal responsibility. You don't want to punish people for being.
Well, yeah.
I mean, obviously, you do punish people for being irresponsible. There are things like manslaughter, drink, and that sort of thing. But I'm not talking about the punishing. I'm not talking about punishing people.
I'm a little confused. I'm sorry, I'm a little confused. It sounds like you're saying that you don't want people to irresponsibly have children, which would suggest that you should actually have abortion then, because if people irresponsibly have children when they're not ready for them and they bring them into society.
I think I'd like to interject here, because I think we're getting a little bit off, but I want to I think it's a good topic of discussion, and I want to sort of change the way we're looking at it. So, if we're talking about abortions, it seems like the conversation, the narrative is very much around what a woman's rights are. She has the right to abort. She has the right to a safe haven. She has the right to have it adopted. What do you, Philip, what, if anything, rights do you feel are the other partner's rights in this, whether it be another woman, if they're a lesbian couple, or if it's another man? What if other rights do you think the partner has?
Well, you're dealing with two different situations. You're dealing with a pregnant woman, and then afterwards you're dealing with a couple, in this case, who has an already born child. For me, for example, I look at it from a straight bodily rights issue. Until the actual moment of birth, you're dealing with the woman's right to what she does with her body. After that, then you're dealing with something else. Now, we have a problem in American society where we don't really have effective social programs for doing this. Personally, my opinion is the best way to handle this is we should offer some heavy socialized programs towards taking care of unwanted children. Because the present situation we have right now it's unsatisfactory. What ends up happening is not just the men's rights are violated, but the women as well. You force two people to be in a relationship that they don't want to be in. That's actually what they're finding is the end result of forced child support. It's not just an issue of a man being forced to pay for a child he doesn't want. You're dealing with a woman who doesn't want to have anything to do with that man. Now, my solution to that would be, well, in that case, we should socialize that kind of care. It's a small portion of the population. If we can get past old stereotypes, for example, like the welfare witch, which is just one of those tiresome stereotypes, it's not really representative of the majority of the population, that would be the healthiest way for us to deal with it. But as far as rights leading up to the moment of birth, that's just a matter of that is the rights of what the mother has to do in that situation, or the woman in that case, because she's not even necessarily a mother at that point until after the birth.
Quantum, this may be a question for you. There's a young woman in the chat who seems to feel like this conversation is a woman's rights issue. Would you agree with that? Is this the purview exclusively a woman's body, a woman's choice? Is that at the purview exclusively of a woman, or should the father of the child also have any say? What are your thoughts on that?
I think I should just make the position clear because I've been talking about responsibility in the last bit, but I am for abortion. Just to be clear about this, I don't think you should be able to abort after a certain number of weeks, but I am basically in favour of the system that we have in the UK now, albeit with perhaps more nuance. If you come from a poor background or you don't understand what's going on, that sort of thing, you should be sympathetic towards that. And there's very little point in prosecuting people that. So just to be clear, because I think there might be this is the sort of thing where misunderstandings happen. I am actually pro-abortion. With regards to whether it's a woman's right issue, basically yes. I think it becomes more complicated after the baby's been born. I mean, it's difficult because I want a situation where both the woman and the man take responsibility for their actions. I mean, obviously, you don't want a child brought up in a sort of under a single mother. That's just a really bad idea. I mean, single parent households are very bad for children. They do quite badly out of it. So I think I don't like the idea that if you're a man you can just impregnate someone then run off. I don't really like that sort of idea. I think the responsibility should be on. I think there should. Okay, I mean basically, the legislation that we currently have, I don't really see too much of a problem with it. It's perhaps a little. I perhaps would make it more nuanced, but there's always a difficulty with making laws more nuanced. They become less practical, and practicality is something that you need in law. So it's a very difficult question. Yeah, has that really answered the question? I don't really know how to answer that question.
I don't think so, but it was a good try.
I don't know all the answers. I don't know all the answers to these questions. I think.
I don't know what the situation is over in the UK. I know that over here the issue of child support and it's kind of similar to the entire. It's ironic if you look at like some of the articles on the wage gap, or like the wage gap myth. There's actually been articles done where they call it the myth of women having a superior opportunity when it comes to getting the child in divorce cases. They've actually found that, at least in the last 10 years, that hasn't really been the case. Only maybe about 53%, I think it is, of the cases are actually the woman has decided to have the child according to the couple. Like, they discuss it and they work it out amicably. Really, only about 3% of the cases go to trial and a judge decides. And I'm not saying it doesn't happen. I know there are people out there, there are men who absolutely suffer when it does happen, but at the same time, it's not the huge major issue in the sense that it's happening chronically like people make it out to be.
I think it did used to happen more.
Well, during the 90s, there was a bit of an issue because, I worked at one point. I was working with a group who was trying to aid with the ID situation we had here in America after 2001. After 2001, when we had 9/11, especially like in New York City, they cracked down on the requirement for having ID and how you could get ID. So we tried to start a program which would help people who were essentially matriculating into the population after having been in prison, drug addicts, that kind of thing. So that they could get themselves back on their feet again. And one of the things they needed was basic ID, which in Western society today you can't do a hell of a lot without. And I would have to go in and I would have to do questionnaires and ask these people what were the issues they were facing. And I had to get to the point where I had to announce before I started, I had to say what we're here for, and I had to say, however, I have to make it clear to you all, we do not handle child support cases. Because just about everybody in that room, male or female, if you asked them and you didn't specify that, they had a child support case issue, either the women not being able to collect or the men not being able to collect. And it became pretty apparent to me that the problem itself, it was really like more of a poverty issue. It's this is something that actually you get with feminism as well. I'm going to own up to this because it's a fact. Feminism does have a bit of a problem when it comes to minority groups. It's hard to outreach, especially for white feminists. As a man, I have a problem outreaching the women because I'm not a woman. So right there, like I can argue for feminism. I can fight for the rights of women, but I can never truly understand a woman's position and what it is to be a woman in America.
Well, I kind of disagree with that. I mean, my view is that it really should not matter who you are. I think actually there's sometimes something to be said from coming from a position of objectivity where you're not directly involved in the issue. I mean, there's a reason why I guess you don't want.
That's not the same thing as understanding.
You don't want victims of crime being able to decide the sentence. I mean, they're heavily involved in the case, so they're obviously going to be biased. I think there's actually something to be said from coming from an objective viewpoint. I mean,
I never said there isn't. I'm saying, however, that you can't actually know what that group is going through. You can try to offer your support and aid, and you can even offer an objective opinion, but at the same time, you're not them.
And just to be clear, because I know this is going to come back to bite me. I'm not saying the converse either. But what I am saying is I don't think you have to be in a position to understand it from a social policy point of view. I mean, I think there are advantages of being involved in the position, and I think there are disadvantages of being involved. And I've just gone over one of the disadvantages, but there are advantages as well. And I would say, I think I read in the comments before we started this, there was someone left a comment along the lines of, why aren't there any women on the panel? That sort of.
Yeah, that's always a good question. I have to say, I think it's always a good question, and usually it should be addressed. We probably should have, but because we should have put up the He-Man Women Haters Little Rascals picture for this, something like that, just to kind of like, it would have been fun.
But I mean, from my perspective, I mean, social policy in my view, and it isn't. I mean, this is the unfortunate thing in the UK. Social policy is not dictated by the evidence in social sciences or the physical sciences, and I think it should be, but it isn't, and it's never going to because of the way politics and democracy works. I mean, democracy is a flawed system.
Yeah.
There's nothing better than democracy, though. So this is never going to happen. This is idealistic, but there's something to be said for social policy that's based on evidence, logic, and reason. I don't think that not being emotionally involved in something is a handicap. And I wouldn't say that being involved is a handicap either. Although, like I said, there are certain examples where you don't want that to be the case because of the confirmation bias, but like the criminal case I brought up. But from my perspective, if someone was to ask why aren't there any women on this panel, for instance, I would say because maybe there are less women interested in these sorts of issues that are willing to have this sort of debate. I mean, perhaps, or I don't know. I mean, I generally do see these debates for instance, in the YouTube community to be more male based. I mean, if I look at my YouTube statistics, my views are about 80 to 90% male. I suspect your views are mostly male as well. I think it's interesting. I mean, I'm very interested in having debates and discussions. I'm less interested in other things. But
since you answered the question, I should probably answer it as well. The reason I would agree to do a debate like this on, for example, feminism when it's just two men is because, like I said, I'm coming from the position that feminism represents gender equality, and the examples, and I would have cited other examples of necessary court cases where the Women's Project from the ACLU not only fought for women's rights, but they fought for men's rights as well. There's like numerous cases they did that. It's like if you keep looking after case where RBG or some of the people who work for the project took on cases for men, and you sit there and you go, holy shit, it's almost like, you can quote Arlo Guthrie, you got 3 cases here at this point, and it looks like you got a movement. It's almost like the MRAs, when it comes to them saying feminism doesn't do anything for men, are kind of like either ignorant or full of shit. Because clearly they do. Clearly there's a track record of history of men being helped by these women's groups. And that's the reason I'm willing to engage in a discussion debate like this, despite the fact that there's no woman here, is because I'm giving my perspective on feminism as a man who has been aided by feminism. And that's as far as I can go. I can't speak for how it affects women. Now, the second point, just let me real quick say the second point on what you said about people who have actual experience. Like, to go back to the 1920s, you look at, for example, Margaret Sanger, when she was trying to help with the birth control and abortion movement, and she spoke to African American women, asking them, what do you need? What are the issues you face? And it's actually one of the reasons she changed her position when it came to sterilization. Like, originally she started out with a position, like, because that was the big thing back then, sterilization. And she eventually changed her position because she spoke to these women on the experiences they went through. She never would have changed her position on that if she hadn't realized how it was negatively impacting on them. And that's why, while you're right, it's fine for us to express opinions as people who can't understand what it's like to be a woman going through this. At the same time, it's important that we do listen to them and we hear their experiences, because they'll tell us things that we never even thought of that could be happening.
I mean, sorry, I'll just finish off this briefly. I mean, I completely agree with that. I don't have any problem with it. And incidentally, if I saw 2 women having a debate on men's right activism or something, and I have actually seen this, it does happen. I wouldn't be completely apathetic to that. I really don't care whether it's a woman or a man having a debate on women's issues or men's issues. I think women having debate on men's issues is good, women having debate on women's issues is good, men having debate on men's issues is good, and men having debate on women. It doesn't matter. All that matters is the points and arguments that you come up with. I don't agree that there should be any that you should have to feel guilty for not.
Now, I have to ask you, do you have a problem with, let's say, if you, like, there's a great picture of one of the Arab nations where they're having a symposium on women's rights, and it's made up of, like, 60 men. Would you look at that and feel uncomfortable and go, yeah, you know what, that's not totally...
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so there are instances where it's an issue.
But that's for completely... I'd feel uncomfortable for
yeah, that would be like, yeah, that's not right. Okay, yeah, so yeah, we have that here in America too. That happens, where you have like symposiums and whatnot in Congress or whatnot, making decisions about women's rights, and it's a panel made up entirely of men, and it's just like, okay, come on, really? Are we really going to do this and make ourselves look this stupid? Well, can we at least make an effort to not look like...
To be clear, so we can understand Quantum's assertions and yours, Philip, Quantum, it's not so important to you that, for example, a black activism group not have white voices. It's more important to you that the argument is substantiated, and based on its merits. Whereas, Philip, you're talking about a more representative view. Somebody may not be able to understand my plight as a black man, for example, if they're not black. Is that where the difference is?
Well, I'd say there's some crossover for me between the two of ours. I like to take both into consideration. I know there's like been a recent push towards the idea of equity feminism. I've always seen that as a false dichotomy, like a splitting off into two separate things that isn't really necessary to do. I think it's done on the conservative right part here in America strictly for political rhetoric reasons, so they can gain position on that debate. You look at, for example, Martin Luther King. He started out with the civil rights movement. He was focused primarily on legislative change. But what a lot of people don't realize is after he got some of that legislative change, he realized that, you know what, the problem is it's more endemic, it's more social. It goes beyond just simply making a change to the law. Even with the changes to the law, we still have issues going on. It's like the law hasn't made the change we need. And if it hadn't been for his abrupt death, the poverty movement he tried to start, which would have addressed on a more like social justice warrior level some of those issues, would have happened. But unfortunately,
Philip,
he died.
If I could get your input on this, because I think you touched on a great point. As a black man, I do often hear the comparison made between the civil rights struggle and the women's rights struggle. What sort of issues do you think are endemic that make that comparison valid today? And I want to get Quantum to bear on whether he finds them persuasive or not.
I'd say in America, for example, one of the problems we have that are comparative between the two is there has been this attitude that we are living in a post-racial society, and it's similar for women as far as like a post-women not having equal rights society. Like everything's great, everything's equal now. The election of Obama in America was this huge thing for us, but at the same time, people were going around going, "That's it. We have a black president. We're in a post-racial society. Everything's awesome now." You look at some of the events that have happened recently in Ferguson. You know, it's apparently that there are still issues in this country when it comes to rights for blacks. You look at the stop and frisk laws in New York City that I don't know if you're aware of them. We've been fighting them for a few years now. They are laws that, while civilly, they can be addressed against any member of the population, be they regardless of race, color, creed, or gender. They've been used exclusively against the black community, and they have actually had no positive result. It's been shown that they are a total waste of time, and despite that, they persisted for years. You look at how with women, they have their issues with abortion. In the 2010 midterms, immediately after taking power, the GOP Senate, they put forward I think it was 300 pieces of anti-abortion legislation. They ran on an economic policy, and the first thing they did was not put forward any economic legislation. They just immediately went after women. And you're seeing this continual trend in our politics, in our society, where it shows that no, we're not living in a post-racial society. Are things better than they used to be 50 years ago? Sure, absolutely. But at the same time, we still have issues for both the women and for minorities, black people, Latino, be it whichever minority group you're talking about. It needs to be addressed. I think they share that in common.
Point taken. Quantum, do you find that a persuasive comparison? Do you think there's systemic women hate in the same way that there's systemic race hate in our society?
Well, I mean, the interesting thing about this is that the prison gap is actually bigger between the sexes than it is between black and white people. So in America...
Was that America or in the UK?
I'm talking about America now.
Okay, yeah.
I suspect it's similar in the UK. I mean, seriously, I don't really know about the race gap in the UK. But this,
well, you sure? Because we have a privatized system. Is yours privatized to the extent ours is?
Our prison system is not privatized, no.
I mean, not all of it. In fairness, not all of it is, but large aspects of it is.
I mean, in the US, I note that there is a gap between the number of men that are imprisoned and the number of women that are imprisoned,
yes.
which is substantially greater than the difference.
And it needs to be pointed out, by the way, that the men in prison, it's always been predominantly black men. So I know this is a men's issue,
yes,
but
yes,
it needs to be said, because otherwise you lose the forest of the trees.
Yes, I understand that if you're a black man, then you're sort of the most likely. I mean, in general, it goes white.
No, it's like
white woman,
millions
black
compared
woman,
like millions of black men
white
compared
man,
to
black
like
man.
250,000 white men, I think is the number. I don't remember the exact numbers. But
Wait a minute.
But the point I wanted to finish off with is this in itself doesn't mean anything, because I don't want to contradict myself here. I'm well aware that men are more likely to go to prison than women because they are more aggressive. Just in general, I mean that's an empirical fact. I mean, I'm not saying that, but having said that, looking at the studies, it does seem to me that there is some compelling evidence that even when you control for that, there is some discrimination in favour of women in the US. I'm not sure about the UK, but I think the UK as well.
Sentencing there absolutely is.
What I find interesting though is that
sentences.
But I don't really see this discussed that much to some extent. I mean, I think we're actually getting off the point here, but there was something more important.
I think it doesn't get discussed. I think it doesn't get discussed in great detail in the gender movement, because it's actually for the outside of the hijacking that the MRAs do on the prison issue, it's really actually considered a Black American issue. Like, it's a problem that's chronically an issue for them. That's my impression on it. I think that's why it doesn't really get brought up beyond just being tossed out to used in the war on feminism, so to speak. But and it's too bad, because it should be focused on more. Like, there's a lot of issues. You have, for example, rape in prison, which we don't have any good statistics on. We just know it happens a lot, and you know, both to men and women. And actually, there's been a lot of interesting work being done in that, where they have prisoners who have gone through rape are now actually doing instructional videos they're making for people who are going into prison to instruct them in how to avoid being raped when going into prison, because apparently it's no longer that situation where you really have like a whole bunch of 5 or 6 people, you know, they catch you in the shower room and they do you over. Now apparently it's more of a coercion kind of thing through favors, and so they teach you, you know, not to take gifts from other prisoners, not to take help unnecessarily, in order to assert that you're not going to be put in a position where you can be coerced due to them, you know, presenting you as if you owe them. So No, I'm sorry. I was just saying that it's an issue that should be focused on more.
I just wanted to briefly say, because I don't want to be accused of avoiding the point, because I remember what the original point was, that was sort of a little bit of a sidetrack. Yes, I do think that there is a racial issue in America. I'm less sure about other countries like the UK. I mean, I still, for all these things, you've still got to control for extraneous variables. So you can't just point at differences in outcome and assume that there's some intervention that's dramatically different. I think you always have to remember.
You have to remember that the majority of the prison population in America is not made up of violent offenders. It's made up of like non-violent drug offenders. We privatized our system back in the 70s, and since 1970 there's been a 732% increase in the number of people who are prisoners in the prison population. That's the dramatic growth we had after we started privatizing the system. And a lot of what we did to get the populace that large is by targeting nonviolent drug offenders. They went after your marijuana smokers, your heroin addicts. They went after people like that, people who really are not going to do any damage to society in any way. And that's been the driving force behind the prison population in America, is essentially getting them in there so they can make money off of them. It's being called the new slavery, because that's essentially what it is. It's a form of slavery where you can put people in prison and then you effectively charge them and their family for all kinds of services. Like, look at the Skype call thing they're doing right now. You're no longer allowed in some prisons to see your loved ones face to face. You have to pay $20, I think it is, for an hour, or I don't know, a minute, something outrageous, for just talk to them on Skype from a building like maybe 500 feet away. And this is the kind of thing we do in America. It's absolutely disgusting. But we're really doing it just to take advantage of a portion of the population, and that's why it tends to be a black issue, because you're taking advantage of what is a predominantly poorer portion of the population in doing this. So it's like when people bring it up as a gender gap between male and women, it's like, and women, I'm like, well, yeah, on the one hand, I recognize what you're saying there, that there's absolutely something to that, we're targeting men specifically, and especially black men, and you have to wonder why that's happening. There's been some interesting papers written that have suggested that the reason they do this is because of it's kind of a form of new slavery. That's why they're going after black men, because that was the slave population in America if you go back far enough, and now it's the slave population now. And I would hazard, and this is totally just opinion, and feel free to shoot me down on it, somebody out there, that maybe initially they didn't go after female prisoners because of the issue of pregnancy in prison is not something they want. It's not like when in American society back in the 1800s, when they stopped transporting slaves and they started basically doing the equivalent of homegrown, just producing their own slaves in country. Like the majority of the slave population at one point was all entirely in country, because I think they no longer were really allowed to transport them in. So you can't do that with the prison population in the 1970s. You can't have women coming in and having babies. So maybe they just decided to focus on the male population for that reason. It was a cheaper way to do it. You didn't have to deal with all those issues.
So Philip, you'll get no arguments from me. I mean, I think we do understand that we arrest non-violent offenders in the majority.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I got off topic there. I know.
No, sure. I think what Quantum and other people are talking to is what's usually referred to as the sentencing discount. And
yeah, there is.
And you accept the argument that we're controlled for same factors when, so from conception.
Oh yeah. There's even they've even done studies where they've controlled for looks, and they found that people who are more attractive actually get lesser sentences than people who are considered uglier.
Wow.
It's like there's a whole bunch of discriminatory things happening in sentencing that it goes beyond just gender. It's like amazing if you look into it.
And when we're really not going to disagree here, because my view on the American justice system is that it's a disgrace to the world. I mean, when you consider that it's actually worse than China in terms of the number of people in prison.
No, it's terrible. It's absolutely.
I mean, it's a third world justice system in a first world country. I completely agree with that. If this is relevant, my view on the justice system is that we should be looking at the Nordic states as being a sort of a model for how things should be done, particularly Norway. But I think that's going a bit to the side. In general, I agree with basically all of that. I don't have any disagreements with any of that. So, I guess I would just say that if you could I don't think it would be conjecture to say that if it was the other way around, and that women were preferentially imprisoned over men, it would be a feminist issue. I mean, I'm almost sure that it would be.
It would be oh yeah, I see what you're saying.
I mean, you cannot imagine a situation where if this was reversed, the feminists it would be a constant issue that they would always be talking about. But since it's actually in this case, it's actually the men that are getting the short stick. I mean,
I think the problem why it hasn't gotten a lot of attention is it has less to do with feminists not focusing on it because it's a men's issue. It has more to do with the fact that prisoners are not considered human beings in this country.
But it's still.
So we don't really care about them. It's.
But you could say that, but then on the other hand, if you reverse the situation, this sort of logic would still not apply. It would still. I mean, if it was black women that were getting the short end of the stick rather than black men, then it would still be a feminist issue. It would be a race issue as well, but it would still be a feminist issue. I mean.
Philip, do you find that persuasive? Because I've heard a similar argument, and I find that one that resonates with me. It does seem to be that the narrative is largely it gets very hyperbolic whenever a woman is the victim, but when a man is a victim, it tends to be put on the back burner in terms of priority. Is that something that resonates?
Are we talking about in terms of prison? In something that
not just prison. I'm talking about in a number of the areas of men's rights. Take for example something like circumcision. That would seem, if were it done to a woman, it would be rather objectionable. But because it's done to a man and because it's couched in sort of religious tradition, it tends to be low priority. And even though you may agree that it's a valid concern, I think what Quantum is touching on is the amount of attention it receives.
The problem with circumcision in this country is that
that was just an example. You don't have to address that per se. I think I'm asking.
I would say generally, if you're going to ask me ask me a general question of this nature, I would have to answer generally and say that yes, sometimes it happens with men and sometimes it happens with women. It comes up. Of course, there's going to be circumstances, both ways. I'm sorry if that's not very satisfactory, but it's hard to address an answer. It's hard to give an answer on something that general. without getting into details.
Sure. Well, that's fair enough. So I wanted to move on to those listening. By the way, we are opening up for questions.
By the way, Pooka, are you okay to continue a little bit? Because I realised that we've actually run over quite a lot.
Yeah, it's actually almost getting into 2 hours. I know I had said I was going to do a question answer, but unfortunately I didn't realize we'd run so late. What we could always do too as well is if you want to do a follow-up.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to do a follow-up.
Because I do unfortunately have to get going. I've enjoyed it, but we're getting into 2 hours here, and I didn't expect it to be this long.
Sure. Yeah, I guess we'll have to save some of those questions for the next time. I'll let you guys go ahead and make closing statements then if you want. Philip, Quantum. It sounds like you guys have a lot of overlap. There's also some areas where you disagree, so let you guys open up for just a couple closing statements, and we'll let you run, Philip.
No, Quantum, please go first. Absolutely. I'd like to hear what he has to say.
Well, I'm actually really surprised. I didn't think that we would disagree on everything, but I'm surprised on how much common ground there actually is here. I think the main thing to take away from this is that sometimes you can become polarized to the point of irrationality, and this applies to both sides, I would agree. I did not expect to have this kind of conversation at all. I expected a completely different kind of conversation. From what other people have said as well, I did not expect.
I should have been more reasonable. I'm sorry. I should have called you a cunt or something.
Well,
must have been something I could have said. I'm sorry. Should I not have said that? We're live. It's. I should. Yeah, I don't know what to tell you about.
Because I mean, I think you would actually, if you would have done that, I think the person that would be less.
People would have liked it better.
I mean, what would have got more views. There are some people that would actually get more offended by that. Simply because you use the word cunt, then
I unfortunately I have UK relatives and I went to school there for a while, so I have to watch that. There's certain words I picked up from different cultures that I have to be wary of when I'm in America. You can't use over here. So.
Well, I mean, my view on language is that I think people are too. I mean, I don't like hypersensitivity. I mean, it's quite good that we talked about big issues today, but I mean, we could have talked about something like Gamergate, which to me I think is getting. I mean, I provisionally.
Well, that's an entirely different topic.
Well, I don't know whether we wanted to go into that, but I'd say that. For instance, feminism getting involved in these sorts of areas that I would consider to be first world problems, I think that is ridiculous. I think worrying about female characters in video games, that sort of thing, it just doesn't. I mean, I would say I'm apathetic, but I'm more against it because I don't like the idea of living in a culture where you have to walk on eggshells around everyone all the time. I mean,
I'm not going to respond to that because if I do, then we're going to be here another hour.
Yeah, exactly.
But there are things I could say.
That sounds like a good point of contention we can pick up at a later date.
Yeah, I have to say though, I mean, I don't know what to tell you as far as you not expecting the conversation we had. I do know that from the MRA community, from their leadership, there has been a continual. Very aggressive campaign to portray myself and others as unreasonable. I have to share this. It's kind of amusing. I had an exchange with I believe it was her name is Judgy Bitch. I didn't really know much about her. Where somebody had asked me if I would host a debate on my channel with them and her, and because apparently they were fighting on Twitter, these two people, and I told the person, I was like, oh, I'll host a debate on my channel if you want, so you can express your views. So so he was like, yeah, go check your Twitter. So I go check my Twitter, and I see this person, Judgy Bitch, is saying, well, is it true? Will you host a debate? Will you have a debate on your channel? And I said, yeah, sure. I'll do it. I have no problem with it. I'll sit there and not say anything quietly as long as you don't do something that's going to get me shut down. That's really the only rule. I was like, that's the only rule I really have is don't get me shut down. That I'm not going to allow. And then the next thing she did is she said, oh, I know who you are. I won't have anything to do with it. She started accusing me of approaching her to start trouble, essentially. And I was just like, what are you talking about? You poked me. And this is the kind of interaction I get. I had Dean Ismay, for example, from A Voice for Men. I had an exchange with C.H. Summers. I don't know if you saw the video. I found a video. And where I pointed out that there was something on A Voice for Men on the site. I said, they're not really citing you properly. It makes you look like you write for the site. And C.H. Summers said, Christine is.
Yes. Okay. I actually watched that YouTube video. Yeah.
Oh, you saw the video? Yeah, no, I'm sorry. So she was like, yeah, okay, I see it. She was like, yeah, I could see the basically she said the attribution is sloppy. I'll say something to them, and he had a fit. and he did what he always does in these circumstances. He accused me of being a liar. And I just finally got fed up. I was like, I don't know what to say. You're accusing me of being a liar. You're also accusing Christina of being a liar as well, because she agreed with me. And finally, it's the only reason I did the video is because just for years they've been doing this. They've been accusing me of being crazy and irrational and a liar and whatever. So I did that just kind of as a testimony. And now when somebody says, well, they say this about you, I just link that video and I go, you know what? Watch this. Decide for yourself. I don't know what else to say to you. I don't want to fight it.
I mean, it's nice to see that people like you and Christina or Summers can get on. Because
I don't agree with everything she says, but I see the validity of her having a voice in the debate.
Would you real quick, Philip? Would you say somebody like Christina Hoff Sommers is a feminist? She would define herself as one. Is that objectionable to you?
My understanding is that she defines herself as an equity feminist, which means she focuses exclusively on the law, and that the law should represent both equally. In that sense, I have no problem with the idea of her identifying herself as a feminist. I'd have a problem with somebody like Phyllis Schlafly identifying as a feminist, a woman who is clearly an anti-feminist, clearly out of the religious right. I mean, her son Andy started Conservapedia, and she was one of the major movers who shot down the Equal Rights Amendment back in the 80s that was going to get women equally represented in the military, so we would get that not gender-specific selective service for the draft that we've been fighting for a long time, which a lot of people are opposed to. As a matter of fact, I don't know if you've been following the news, everything I said in the video back when about what has to happen to have that male-only selective service shut down or shot down has finally happened. We basically are in the process. It's actually it's the Women's Rights Project. They're responsible for that. Them and I believe it's the NWO. They brought a case with a number of females I believe it was female soldiers that finally made the Department of Defense change their position. So her, for example, Phyllis Schlafly, no, if she identifies as a feminist, I say absolutely not. No, you're not a feminist when you actively seek for an inequality in rights between men and women by keeping women out of the military and mandatory selective service. Christina Howe Sommers, no, I don't have a problem with that. I disagree with some of what she says, but that's different.
All right, well, I think that is as good a place as any. Try as I might to get you guys to disagree, there is a surprisingly large amount of common ground between you, which is always a good thing to hear at the end of the day. So it sounds like we're not too far off from each other. But on that note,
do you want to do maybe another one then, perhaps?
Yeah, we can absolutely. Yeah, that could happen at some point. I mean, let's go check schedule and everything.
Okay.
No, we can. I feel like I'm giving your show like a terrible ending. We should be saying something like really like with that punchy ending.
But I mean,
we can do this sometime. Yeah, my people talk to your people.
I'm not. One reason I chose to do it on a Saturdays because I feel guilty about just dominating because my show is usually on a Sunday. So I think I don't want to. Because usually we have 5 or 6 people in, and it's like an open thing. So I don't really want to do it on a Sunday on my show. I think
we can work something out. It can be worked out. We'll discuss it later. Let's not hem and haw at the end of your show and give it that fabulous ending of is this thing still on? Let's not do that.
We should have done fuck it. We'll do it live right at the beginning.
Yeah. All right. I'm going to let you go. It was good speaking to you. And I enjoyed being on your show. I will say, for those who remember, ladies and gentlemen, if you found any of these words upsetting, pet the cat.
All right. Thank you, Philip, for joining us, Quantum. I'll let you. I think you've said your piece. Unless you have anything else to say, you could probably go ahead and end it.
Yeah, I'll just stop the broadcast now. Thanks, everyone, for coming.
Thank you, everybody.